scientific image and the manifest image, and it's nice to have both of these cohere as much as possible. But like, yeah, there's loads of ways you could do that. And if you had to try and like determine the truth doing this, you'd go mad. I mean, there's no way you could really survey everything and like balance absolutely everything out. You just have to sort of do some stuff, do some work, think of things. It's like if you had to know that your chess opening is going to get you a win, you'd never play a move. You have to take a leap and see what happens, it seems to me.
Welcome everyone to today's interview, where we are very pleased to welcome Dr. Alex Malpass. His work focuses on philosophical logic, philosophy of time, philosophy of physics, and more. You can check out his website at useofreason.wordpress.com, and he also runs the Thoughtology YouTube channel. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Dr. Malpass.
Cool. Thanks for having me. You've had a lot of very good guests on this channel, most underrated YouTube philosophy channel, it seems to me. So it's an honor to be part of that roll call. It was, very nice.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate it. It's been an absolute pleasure and honor getting to talk to so many great philosophers.
I bet.
Especially having already read some of their work and just then getting a chance to talk to them about it. It's been great. So what I wanted to talk about today, what we're going to focus our discussion on, is going to be a lot of the stuff related to arguments concerning whether the past is finite or whether causal finitism is true. These are related, but not necessarily the same thing. And a lot of that came up in a video I published a few weeks ago on Did the Universe Begin? So viewers might want to check that out. With that, I think we'll just kind of jump into some of the things that come up there and maybe get into some of the more finer details. So the first paradox that I discussed was the Grim-Reaper paradox, or the Grim-Reaper argument. I'm not sure if it's worth restating here what the actually, people can check it out there, but I'm just going to restate it here briefly. So the idea is there's a few different ways to formulate it. And of course, there's a more basic structure that's common to a lot of these different arguments. But the idea, I think the original idea for, in Koons's paper at least, was that you have sort of infinitely many Grim Reapers, each given a very similar task. And there's a particular person, Fred, and if he's alive, at 1 minute past noon, there's a Grim Reaper that's tasked to kill him. There's another one that's tasked with the same thing, except for 30 seconds past noon, 15, 7.5, 3.75, and so on. And such that there's going to not be a first Reaper in this sequence. And the key thing is each one will kill him so long as, he's still alive. No previous Reaper has killed him. And you can show rather easily that this result is absurd. They can't all satisfy their given task. In fact, the whole situation is impossible. So you can say whatever you want. And you can generate the same sort of paradox stretching back to an eternal past. And people have used this sort of argument to conclude, time can't be continuous or dense, or that I suppose, the past can't be eternal. Just as that's a sort of brief statement of it. And one response is just to say that, okay, so what? These things aren't they form a sort of unsatisfiable pair that's inconsistent, so it's impossible. But that doesn't show that a Grim Reaper style sequence is impossible in general, or that a finite or infinite pass is impossible in general. So I'll let you come in there, I guess. What do you think about, is that sort of the basic response you would give, or what do you think about this?
Yeah, so I take there's basically, there's the paradox as you describe it. It's kind of family of paradoxes that the version you started off with seems to show that if you can cram infinitely many reapers into some finite interval at diminishing spaces between them, so it kind of converges on some particular point without there being an earlier one, then that has some significance for whether or not time is infinitely divisible, if it's dense or not. You see, feels like if you can pack them in like that, and each of them can, have that property where they kill Fred if and only if Fred's still alive, then this weird situation arises. And people like Koons, there's a bunch of people who take a sort of similar position on this, where they effectively say that the idea that the Reapers could, kill Fred if and only if he's still alive is just obviously true. That, I mean, just pick some individual Reaper on his own, he could kill Fred if Fred's still alive, right? It's an easy, and we can just talk about it, a sort of mechanism that prints out the date onto a piece of paper if the input is blank or something. You can make it into a very easy to make electrical circuit or something. It seems like it's possible for one of those things to exist. But now if you could cram them all into a sequence like that, then you're in trouble. And so they say the way out of this is to blame the sequence. Like, that's the thing that couldn't exist. So in this case, it shows you that time couldn't be dense, because if it could be dense, then you could fill it with mechanisms like that, Reaper mechanisms like that. And that's impossible. So something's got to go, and they want to blame the sort of metaphysical assumption. So set the same argument out again, but regularly space them throughout a beginningless past. And now your metaphysical assumption is that there's a beginningless past, right? So that's what's got to go. So this is common strategy for dealing with this, is to make a kind of metaphysical concession to avoid the otherwise sort of contradictory paradoxical consequences that would be there otherwise. And that, there are other people who've made metaphysical moves to avoid the problem. Hawthorne has this idea that maybe you can say that all of the Reapers kill Fred without any of them actually doing it or something, and tries to draw this analogy of, like, if you throw a ball through a window, none of the particles are such that they broke the window, but all of them collectively did. The particles that make up the ball. So something like that. Maybe that's how it works. Whatever. Maybe. But you can make these kind of metaphysical, as long as you give up some or make some metaphysical claim, I guess. Commit yourself to something that might do away with the problem. The thing about Hawthorne's idea, it seems to me, is that, like, even if you make that metaphysical concession, you can just cook up other versions of the paradox that aren't avoided by that. It's a sort of parochial way of dealing with it. And what we don't want to do is make individual metaphysical concessions for each and every possibly infinite variety of versions of that paradox, because you'd just be there forever giving metaphysical ground away to this paradox, and that won't do, right? Sort of gross violation of Occam's razor to do that. Graham Priest thinks that maybe it's one of these true contradictions. Maybe that's okay, then, because maybe if you think there are true contradictions anyway, what's the problem giving up on another one over here? So those are all kind of types of approaches to this, where you make a kind of logical or metaphysical concession to avoid trouble that you'd be in otherwise. But I think the view I go for is also shared by a number of other people. But I think the sort of defining paper for this is by this guy called Nicholas Shackle, who has this paper called The Logical Form of the Benedetti Paradox. And he advocates this idea called an unsatisfiable pair diagnosis. And effectively, he's he's like saying, well, there's just something logically impossible about anything satisfying a kind of schema that's at play in any of those versions of the paradox. And it's just that nothing can satisfy that because it's just contradictory. And the idea with this move is you don't have to make a metaphysical concession to get away from the consequences. It's just that nothing can satisfy both of two conditions, right? The first condition is there's some structure, like an ordered, a set of elements that are ordered into a total ordering, such that like towards one direction it's open, the other direction it's closed. So think of the negative integers, right? And then that's the first condition, something that with that type of structure. So as you were talking about before, the interval between 11 o'clock at this end going down open interval towards 10 o'clock at this end, that's something that satisfies this structure. So would be the present moment here and the infinite beginningless past going off in that direction. So anything that pick something with that type of structure. And also there's let's call that the A condition, and the B condition would just be that like there's a property that holds every element in that structure, which is P is true, some property P is true if and only if P is true at some point, if and only if it's not true at any of the previous points, right? And that property holds at every single point. And then the idea is just, well, you can just derive formally a contradiction now. So you can make a sort of mathematical model of that, try and satisfy that predicate, and you just find that actually you have contradicted yourself. So the assumptions that go into it are just mutually contradictory. So then it's just, well, now it's nothing to do with space or time or causality or anything like that. It's just you've described a mathematical structure that's inconsistent. You don't have to do anything now. I mean, that's it, right? We've done our jobs. As logicians, we can walk away from this happy. But, well, I think the kind of pushback against this would be there's a number of different, well, there's actually not that many, but there's a couple of different lines of pushback against this. And so the one that's sort of there in the literature is what I describe as a mysterious force objection. So you see this in Proust. You also see this in this guy called Lorenzo Luna. It's quite like pushes this argument or this objection quite strongly. And the idea is like, look, it's all very well to say that the two propositions here are logically inconsistent with each other, but imagine you've got all these reapers lined up like that. The fact that it's logically impossible for them to satisfy this predicate doesn't like determine which one doesn't do his job or whatever. Like, well, it's one of them's got to slip on a banana skin or something so that he doesn't kill Fred when he's supposed to, or maybe they all have to slip on banana skins or something like that. But like, just saying it's logically impossible doesn't seem like it's enough to explain what happens to prevent it from obtaining. And the idea that would be we're treating logic as if it has some mysterious force that can affect things in the world from happening, which otherwise would happen. I mean, that has some kind of, I mean, Yablo has this paper which is not really about this, but in my view, it kind of is, although I'm not sure he ever really puts it in terms of this Benedetti paradox. But he's talking about a very, very similar paradox anyway, which sometimes is referred to as Yablo's paradox. It's a kind of semantic version of this. Imagine a set of sentences like S1, S2, S3, S4, and each sentence is true if and only if none of the Sn is true if and only if none of the Sn plus M is true. And it's basically the same version. It's basically like saying he's killed Fred if and only if none of the previous ones have. So it's a completely semantic version of the paradox. And here he basically just says that like logic prevents it from being the case that those sentences could satisfy that predicate. Just logic just is the thing that stops it from taking place. And that makes it sound like logic is an action. It's sort of doing something. It's just kind of causal force. So I can see where Luna's coming from if that's what's talked him into thinking about this. It's just that it just seems to me it's a kind of misframing the nature of the proposal. Like it's not that like logic prevents something from happening. And I've had this paper kicking around for a while, which is in review again, another journal, because well, it may be that I keep running into Lorena Luna, who's reviewing it. Well, there's certainly somebody there who seems to take a different view to me when it gets reviewed. But it, think about the person trying to cross all of the bridges of Königsberg without doubling back on themselves, right? They're not going to manage to do that because it would make it's a non-Eulerian circuit, so it can't be completed. You can't make an Eulerian route through that sort of topology or whatever it is. But no one's going to say, topology stops the person from completing that task, as if topology was like some causal agent or something. It's just that when you understand the kind of mathematics there, you just realize that it's impossible to do. And it seems to me that there's no more of a mysterious force in play with this Benedetti case than there is in other cases like that. You might. So it seems to me that intuition pump works in my favor. You might try and say, well, actually, what it's like is a time travel case where Tim goes back in time with a gun, points it at his grandfather, and pulls the trigger. Right? And he can't kill his grandfather, because if he did, then he wouldn't have been born to go back. Blah blah blah. But at the same time, like, logic's not going to stop him from pulling the trigger. And to think that it would do is just commit to some mysterious force here again. And if you like that type of argument, you might say, well, therefore time travel is impossible, right? Then that's the way out of that paradox. On the other hand, you might say it's not, it's just that something consistent will take place. There's going to be a bunch of various consistent stories that might that could happen. Maybe Tim slips on a banana skin or whatever. But like, if you just tell a story where he kills his grandfather, then what you've done is you've just contradicted yourself. It's taken a long time to contradict yourself. So that's just an inconsistent story. So that's impossible. But there are loads of consistent scenarios where he does pull the trigger and the gun jams or whatever. So it's not that logic prevents him. It's just that, picture the woman trying to cross all the bridges again. Something will happen. She'll get halfway around and realize she can't do it, or get bored and wander off, or slip and fall in the river or something. But logic isn't making any of those things happen. They're just, if you actually try and do it, this is what will happen. So I think that, the time travel case can be thought of in the same way. It's just, that's the kind of David Lewis idea anyway. It's a straightforward view about that. So I don't know. It just seems to me that the mysterious force objection doesn't have too much bite to it, basically. At best, you've got a kind of hand-wavy reference to the grandfather paradox. But even there, I mean, it just feels like there's a perfectly reasonable way that you can just say, yes, it is like the grandfather paradox, and that's why no causal force is required. I'm happy with the Lewis solution there. So I don't know. Yeah, for me, right. So that's like, I guess, the first major, and really the only one I've seen in print where someone's tried to push back against this unsatisfiable pair diagnosis. So that's in Pruse's book on infinity, causation, and paradox, and in a couple of papers by Lorena Luna. If there are other people talking about that, I've not found them. But then, there's another sort of one. I talked to Rasmussen about this. I think his idea is something along the lines of like, it's a kind of, well, I will use the word slippery slope, but it does feel like the right way to describe it. So it's kind of like a dimension or something where if you start off on one end saying like, one Grim Reaper on his own, that's possible. And I kind of agree, I guess, fair enough. Some mechanism that prints out its own date or something. Why not? Let's say that's possible. And he thinks that there's no like non-arbitrary stopping point from that to the paradoxical case. And the kind of principled thing to do is to blame the kind of container that holds them all or something. Well, I mean, now is where it gets into the kind of like it gets into your theory of metaphysical modality, I guess. So like, it seems to me that there is a fairly strong principled way of blocking that progression from that one thing that looks fairly plausible to a thing that's contradictory. But it involves a specific theory of metaphysical modality. And the version, say Kuhn's version of the argument, has this kind of patchwork principle, which I know you wanted to come on to, so I don't want to jump the gun here too much, but I guess the other way of going about this involves rejecting that, which I know you also have things to say about, because you did in your video.
Yeah, very good. That's that's a pretty great overview. I did want to mention a couple of things. You mentioned Luna, I think, and the Diablo. I think the Diablo style paradox, Luna, and I think Jacobus Erasmus has used a similar version, I think he calls it persistent liar paradox or something like that. I mean, it's the same structure though. So, although interestingly though, in that case, it's not going to do to say that it's impossible that you would have people saying these things, but it's going to be impossible that they're all true, or that there's you're going to have some logic liar-like paradox that you're going to generate just in a simple case. But anyway, so my thought on the mysterious force objection, I really, maybe I'm just on the same page as you. I just don't get it, right? What we're describing here is consistent ways the world might be or could have been. Some of those involve perhaps people traveling in time, or trying to perform a certain task, and had they or were they to try to perform the task a particular way, they wouldn't be able to do so. They would fail. That's the consistent world is one at which they fail. It's not like there's something stopping them, except that, I mean, we're only looking at the consistent worlds. I'm not sure what else to say about that. And on there was something else I was going to get to. Well, obviously there's a lot of things here. Oh yes, on the issue of there being, if we can have one Grim Reaper, then okay, we could have two and three, and then why would it seems strange that there would be some cutoff? What would be stopping them from having more? Well, I don't want to say that there's something stopping there from being more Grim Reapers in the past. There just, in fact, are some, if there are Grim Reapers, in some possible world, there is a first one in a particular sequence. There could have been more, in the sense that maybe there's some other possible world which has a longer sequence. But whichever world we look at, so long as it's a possible world, we'll have a finite sequence.
Well,
right?
Or they're not exhibiting that property.
Right. I'm just assuming that they have the property in question. Right. I mean, you could say that. Yeah. I mean, does that seem right to you? Like, there's just going to always be finitely many in a sequence in any possible world. I don't see what's wrong.
It seems. I mean, I've got a fairly simple view about this. I don't claim to be able to say with much authority what exactly which worlds are. I mean, describe a scenario to me imperfectly, and I can only really guess whether that's part of a possible world or not. I mean, it may be, but so what I can see quite clearly is that, I mean, assuming the law of non-contradiction is true, right? Then that by definition there aren't any possible worlds that are inconsistent, and we know logically, very straightforwardly, that there's no world that's consistent which satisfies both of those A and B conditions from earlier. So are there worlds that are infinitely old with Grim Reapers sort of sitting around playing board games instead of killing Fred if he's still alive or something, some other property or whatever? I don't know. I don't know. Maybe there are, maybe there aren't. Are there, only finite sequences of causes in every logically possible world? I don't know. I mean, maybe there are, maybe there aren't. All I'm saying really is that there aren't any possible worlds where both of those A and B conditions are satisfied. But everything else, the defender of the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis doesn't need to take up the burden of saying exactly which worlds. Doesn't need to draw a precise circle around the whole of modal space. I mean, why would they have to do that? They're not making an argument that requires them to take a stand on exactly what's possible and what isn't. They're just simply saying, common assumptions between everybody in this debate, apart from the dialethists, I guess, is that consistency is key here. So as long as you agree with that, we're all still on the same page of saying there aren't any possible worlds where both of those A and B conditions obtain. And I just get off the bus before making any decision whatsoever about if there are infinite worlds or worlds with infinitely many reapers in doing other things or whatever. We just don't need to commit to that. So, and it feels like it goes beyond my ken to say anything about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. But I was thinking like, I mean, if consistency is all we're looking for, I mean, if I could describe a pretty small world, so to speak, where we have some empty space except for some finite sequence of reapers performing the task.
Yeah.
It seems pretty, I think we have good reason to think not only that I think we have good reason to think that that's logically possible, at least. I mean, do you think that's going too far in talking about modal space?
No. So I guess, it's much easier if we can sort of just talk about the propositions involved, and
right.
Fair enough. Maybe we can state some propositions, but normally what we're doing with these kinds of things is giving it very, very schematically. So we talk about some set of propositions P, Q, R, ... I mean, maybe you can fill in a physically realistic picture with Grim Reapers that doesn't contradict anything else. Yeah, possibly that's right. But until you actually go away and do that, I mean, I don't know how you fill in all of those dots. So it doesn't really matter. I mean, sure, if you like, let's see what happens on the assumption that that's logically possible. And I think that's fine. It's very reasonable to say that. But it's just, I guess I'm being quite guarded because it's just that the person who's making the UPD position just doesn't need to get into that. It just doesn't matter. They're just simply saying the paradox doesn't license this idea that the past has to be finite. But I don't have to take any particular view any further than that, because some of the strategies employed by Proust is like him saying, well, look, it's obviously possible that you could have so picture this like the sequence you had at the beginning where they infinitely many of them crammed into an hour, on a converging sequence or whatever back towards 10 o'clock. And he says, well, imagine there's just one Reaper at 9:59 and 59 seconds, just prior to all of the rest of the Reapers, when he just kills Fred, right? And all of the others wake up and see Fred's dead, and that's cool. There's no contradiction. So that's possible. So he's saying that's obviously possible. Now, the person, in my view, has to make this kind of absurd jump to saying, we'll just remove that one Reaper at the beginning, and then you've got something that's impossible. And that seems wrong, right? So, but what's going on is a kind of burden shift, because I don't have to say one thing or the other about whether that sequence is possible with the initial Reaper at the beginning. I'm not committed to that. I don't have a proof of its consistency. I'm just, if that's all we describe about it, I can't see a contradiction. But maybe it is anyway, right? So what, right? So that's why I'm being particularly guarded about this. I guess in a different conversation, I'd probably just shrug and say, "Gee, I don't know. Yeah, let's say it's possible." But here at this point, because the dialectic is quite delicate, it pays to not be led into making claims that you don't need to defend. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. That's a good point. I mean, I think I wouldn't mind defending that at least some of those are consistent, but dialectically it might be better to not do so. And that, I mean, my general approach in that video was like, I don't think these arguments succeed in showing that the past had to be finite or that causal finitism is true. But I don't think I was really trying to defend that it was possible that the past was eternal or something like that.
I suppose just to be clearer about it, what I'm saying is, I mean, on the logical possibility point, I can't see a contradiction. It doesn't look like there's a contradiction there. So, I mean, if you put a gun to my head, I guess it's logically possible that there's just some finite sequence of reapers of any length and whatever you like. But there's another question, which is that, like, for the argument to work, for the proofs of burden shift argument to work, I should be accepting that it's metaphysically possible, right? Not just consistent, but in some stronger sense of possible. And really, that's when the line I was taking before becomes more relevant, because really, there's no point taking a stand on that question. I mean, like, yeah, okay, it looks free of inconsistency, but I mean, that's nowhere near sufficient for showing that it's metaphysically possible. And we must mean something more than consistent for it to be metaphysically possible. And why bother committing to Grim Reapers, an infinite string of Grim Reapers being possible, just so long as they're playing board games or whatever? And why should I defend that claim? It doesn't help me in any way. It's only going to get me into trouble with his, like, yeah, but remove one of them and now you've got an impossible thing. I don't know. If I needed to commit to that in order to make the position in the first place, that would be one thing. But because I don't, it just seems like it's a burden shift to try and make me defend something I don't need to. So I don't know, maybe that's helpful to have that distinction there.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, there's two ones that you'd be looking at here. The whether you can have sort of just infinitely many reapers, maybe not doing that task, or are we looking at whether it's possible to have finitely many reapers that in fact satisfy the task? I definitely want to say that the latter is metaphysically possible. I mean, we could do it in a way.
Okay. Well, I can give you a principled reason to not take that view. So, and now it's where it comes into your theory of metaphysical modality. But let's suppose this is not a complete theory, but it's a theory that you could have that gives you something like a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition, which is that something like, in my mind, it sort of goes back to Kit Fine's paper Essence of Modality in 95, where the idea is something like, you ground claims about what's possible in claims about the powers of actually existing things. And it just sort of falls out of that initial intuitive idea, like, it's possible that, like, this glass doesn't have wine in it in a minute because it's got some capacity to be empty or whatever. And it's the capacity that this thing actually has, which grounds that larger claim that it's possible that blah, 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 because you might think, well, claims of something being possible is a claim about a world. It's just a global, large scale thing. It's like a maximal consistent set of propositions with every state being, given as either true or false. And if we're just talking about the glass of wine, it feels like there's some strangeness to the claim being about absolutely everything, when in some ways it feels like it should just be like about the glass of wine. And this grounding idea, like, brings you back to the thought that actually that large scale kind of maximal consistent set of propositions itself, all of those are dependent upon this sort of modal furniture of the world, which is things and their capacities. But if that's right, then it just falls out of that theory that when you say something's possible, what you mean is there's a kind of continuation of the way things actually are, in which some things are realizing their capacities in different ways. So, like, I might finish it, I might top it up, I might go and make myself a sandwich, blah, blah, blah. All those things that are the range of possibilities in front of me are characterized by the different actually available things around me, and them fulfilling or not their various capacities that they have. So now we've got this kind of branching picture of what possibilities are. They they permeate towards the future. So when you talk about like, well, I could have had a cheese sandwich instead of a pizza or whatever, what you mean is that like if I rewind to yesterday when we're talking about this, there was a branch that went off towards cheese sandwich instead of pizza or whatever. So it's still branching only towards the future. It's just we think about going backwards and then back up, down the tree and then back up some alternative branch. And we're always talking, so we're sort of locating modal claims at points in time and like thinking about the possibilities always in the future from any given kind of counterfactual point on this big tree of possibilities, blah, blah, blah. Right? So far too quick a sketch of this idea, but what follows is that every possible world, I mean, think about this as being what metaphysical modality is, right? It's not just like pick some random set and see if it's consistent, but it's like what do the actually existing things and their powers, what sort of tree of possibilities do they make, right? That's what metaphysical possibilities are. And I like this picture. It feels kind of intuitive to me. My PhD was basically on this idea, published a bunch of stuff in logic and sort of semantics about this before I got into philosophy of religion. So it's independently liked this idea anyway. Graham Oppy also likes this idea. Actually, Alex Proust likes this idea too. A bunch of people could. That's basically Kripke's view. If you ask me, you might say it's Aristotelian view. It's sort of a bit like some of the things that Aristotle says, right? So on that view, every possible world overlaps with the actual world at some point in time. But now suppose the world is like, suppose that's our theory of metaphysical modality, right? And then suppose the actual world is beginningless, and that at every, say, once a year, on 1st of January, to borrow an example from Wade, what's he called? Tisthammer, I think is how you pronounce that. Wade Tisthammer. Do you know who I mean? Anyway, here's this version of the Benedetti paradox where it's the eternal society where they're flipping a coin once a year and they, I don't know, do something if it's heads and do something else if it's tails, right? And we're just asked to suppose that like it's been heads just by chance every year throughout the entire beginning that's past. Now, obviously, on each time it was flipped, it was possible for it to land tails instead of heads. It's just that it didn't. It landed heads every time. But ask yourself, is it possible, that at every point in the past it landed tails instead of heads? And like you kind of want to say, well, yeah, I mean, just think about each of those coin flips. Just imagine each of them had gone differently. But on this metaphysical picture that I drew a moment ago, what you have to do to find a metaphysically possible world is find a world that overlaps with the actual world at some point and then diverges from that afterwards. But we also said on stipulation that the coin landed heads every previous flip. So if you try and look back through the annals of time for a possible world that branches away from the actual world at some point, in which the coin has always landed tails, you're not going to find it, right? Every world shares an initial segment which has infinitely many heads in it and no tails. So you're never going to find a world that has no heads and only tails instead. So actually, there is a reason to suppose that, like, if the actual world doesn't have infinitely many Grim Reapers waiting to kill Fred, it could have n many Reapers at any point in time, because you could go back n many years and start thinking, well, is it just the future ones have Reapers in? So you can have any finite number of Reapers you like, but you can't have every past time with a Grim Reaper at it. I mean, because that doesn't overlap with the actual world at any point. There's kind of like a distinct branch floating away from the trunk of the tree that never overlaps with it. And on this view, that's just not metaphysically possible, because metaphysically possible just means overlapping with the actual world at some point in time. So now I've given you a kind of an outline of a theory which is plausibly motivated independently. And on that, it just falls out that you don't, it's just not metaphysically possible. So I just don't want to be drawn into defending a claim where I don't need to, and where, in fact, actually, if you push me, I might have a principled reason to deny it anyway, So that's a stronger reason to push back against this, it seems to me. And actually, the kind of annoying thing about this is, if you take that view, you're just kind of out of the frying pan right at the beginning anyway. I mean, like, you're just not going to be able to, unless the actual world has infinitely many reapers in, which like can't happen because that's logically impossible, right? Then it's not even metaphysically possible, right? So and this is the response to the Rasmussen idea, is that's the principal stopping point, right? Like, yeah, one reaper is possible because on my view, I just mean I rewind to yesterday and then picture tomorrow, some possible tomorrow having a Grim Reaper in it. Okay, you want 2 Reapers? Okay, I rewind 2 days and I picture both of the subsequent days having Grim Reapers in. You want 3, I rewind blah, blah, blah. So I can fit n many Reapers in, but I can't fit infinitely many in, even though the past is beginningless, because I have this condition that everything possible overlaps with the actual world. And given that condition, I'm just never going to be able to fit. I can fit any n, but not like every n. So I'm good, kind of thing. I don't even need to like worry. So there's 2 independent ideas here. One of them is this unsatisfiable pair thing, which seems to be good enough anyway. You don't have to pick a theory of modality, or you could just like this theory of modality and not even get into the unsatisfiable pair, or you could like both, and and then you're doubly satisfied. So the Grim Reaper paradox does not keep you awake in any way these days. It's sort of overly determined responses to it now.
Yeah, I did want to talk about that theory of modality. I think all I had in mind, though, with respect to Grim Reapers, I mean, it would be a finite sequence would be possible, right? As you say, right? If we want to say that's possible, having infinitely many Grim Reapers, well, that could be possible, but so long as we're not requiring that they be stretched out infinitely toward the past. Maybe there's a world consistent with the past under which eventually you get infinitely many Reapers. I don't know. But maybe you would still have to deal with the case of, if time is dense or continuous, then you can have the like between 11 and noon versions of the Grim Reaper paradox, or what would you say? Or do you just take unsatisfiable pair there? Or
yeah, right. So I guess if you're just changing the subject from the beginningless past one, then that
right.
result, that specific result I was talking about, doesn't necessarily apply anymore. I mean, you're going to get this just, well, look, unless time is dense in the actual world, you're not in trouble. If it is dense in the actual world, then you've got some explaining to do, and then you could invoke the unsatisfiable pair, I suppose, which seems perfectly fine anyway, right? I mean, like, still, what we're talking about is, I mean, it's something kind of like strange. Just if you just take a step back and think, like, so we've got this result, which is that like there's these 2 propositions effectively which can't be satisfied together. It's kind of no structure satisfies them, and then there's this claim that like, oh, but if you make but in order to avoid them somehow being satisfied, you've got to invoke a metaphysical like principle or something. That to me sounds like a mysterious force, because like, how could it be that unless I invoked causal finitism, a logically impossible, these 2 propositions which can't be satisfied would somehow be satisfied? Why should I be worried about like them actually, materializing this contradiction or something, unless a metaphysical principle was true? Because like intuitively, a contradiction is impossible regardless of what's true in the world, right? Like, no metaphysical claim should make any difference to what's logically possible and what's logically impossible. So it doesn't, maybe nothing exists, right? All of the truths of logic would still be the same, right? That seems to me right. And if that's right, then supposing that unless some metaphysical principle like causal finitism was true, we'd be in trouble metaphysically. It's to suppose that there's some mysterious force going on with your from metaphysics to logic or whatever, and that seems just as implausible as in the first way around. It was like them saying logic doesn't have any causal force, and this way around I'm saying logic is causally inert, right? Like, they're 2 sides of the same coin. I mean, like, you can't like have one without the other. So yeah, logic has no causal force and it's causally inert, and that seems good enough to isolate the result that there's these 2 propositions are incompatible from the requirement to invoke any metaphysical principle as a response to that.
Yeah, yeah. So I did want to talk briefly about that branching view of modality. Um,
Hmm.
so one thing in its favor, it seems, is that it really does capture a lot of the modal claims that we tend to make. So often, especially when we're talking about counterfactual conditionals, we'll say, um, well, either implicitly or explicitly hold fixed the past or as much of the past as we can and ask, given some variation, what would have proceeded from that.
Mm.
Um, you have this, I think, kind of like a Lewis Stallnaker kind of semantics. They have maybe a similar thing going on there, although they don't. It's not strictly the same view of modality. Um, and insofar as um, that this model captures maybe a lot of what we say, modally speaking, that seems fine to me. But if we want to say something stronger, like, well, this is like the actual modality or like the true modal system, that I don't really understand that, right? We can specify different um, modal systems, logical, whatever, metaphysical, nomological. We could invent one. Some of them may be more useful at capturing current discourse or engaging in certain sort of inferences and so forth than others, but none of them is really the true modality of the world, so to speak. I mean, that's a controversial view, maybe, but I guess I don't understand the alternative, if you know what I mean.
Well, I mean, so maybe to take this idea like it's consistent to imagine that like in 10 seconds time a meteorite crashes into the earth and we just explode on a massive fireball or whatever. It's certainly consistent with everything that's true now. Well,
The things that are, except for future tense propositions, maybe, I don't know.
yeah, I mean, it's actually, I think what's consistent, the idea that the Earth is destroyed by an asteroid is consistent. I mean, there's seemingly no contradiction in that supposition. And it doesn't violate the laws of physics to suppose that takes place. And I haven't looked out the window recently, so it's epistemically possible, right? And so on many grades of possibility, it sort of seems like it is possible. But unless there is an asteroid like really close to the Earth, it's not like really possible. It's possible only in an abstract sense. And that, that gives you kind of some idea of what we mean when we say really possible. It's like involving things that are actually true as part of the datum as well, not just a simple test for consistency or a simple test of like what's consistent with what I believe or whatever, but like what's consistent with the things that are actually true, right? And that's what I think we mean by like true modality, real modality, or metaphysical modality or something. It's like there are claims like that seem right. That's an intuition pump I just gave you there. And one way of spelling that out more would be with this branching view or whatever. But like that doesn't describe the whole. It's not the whole story. There's got to be other things you can say there. But yeah, that's the connection between the theory of modality and reality. It seems to me is that like recognizing the difference between these kind of like abstract modalities and something that's more concrete than that.
Yeah, well, I definitely want to allow that there's connections. I mean, the way I tend to think of it is that if you have some modal system with some various axioms and inference rules that are permitted and operators and so forth, and ideally what you have as at the very least, right, what you have as the axioms are going to be things that are like non-modal truths of the actual world, be it principles of logic or maybe laws of nature, depending on what your sort of modal system you're using. And then you ask, okay, how else, what are all the ways a world could be consistent with those axioms and inference rules? And with respect to that modality, so long as I accept the axioms, I'll accept the modal statements you make. And if the axioms are things that are false of the actual world, then I'm gonna, be gonna think that we're not in reliable territory here, especially when you try to draw conclusions about what the actual world is like from that. I don't know. I mean, do you kind of see where I'm going here?
Yeah, so I mean, like if we're talking about picking between systems of modality, then there's not much of a science to this. I mean, like it's people like alethic modalities, right? So but only because it kind of feels right for it to be metaphysical. I mean, and they like S5, but really the reasons for that are quite sketchy. I mean, it's like it just seems like everything that's necessary is it's necessary that it's necessary. It's not contingent that it's necessary. But I don't know that there's a particularly great argument for that. And I don't pretend that that's settled fact. It's like contemporary law or whatever that's the case. So I'm sort of sympathetic to the idea that, like, draw me out a set of inferential procedures and I'll nod along to the deductions you make. But what else is there to say, right? Okay, I get that, but yeah, I mean, we're sort of playing a game to some extent. Like, we're just seeing what the fruits of the hypothesis would be to suppose that some theory like this was right. And it's not a question of like having a firm footing at step one, but it's more like seeing what happens, like a chess opening, right? There's no way of determining, is a king's pawn or queen's pawn opening. I mean, you just have to do one of them, don't you? And just see what happens, like a couple of moves down before you can have any idea how well it's going to be. Might be the greatest opening ever, but it might not be. There's nothing you can really do but play the game and see how it goes. So it's, to me, we're just, there is some speculative element to this modal theorizing, definitely.
Yeah, like consider the like the mirror version of this, where it's not that every possible world shares some initial segment with the actual world, but it shares at least some future segment. Why is that?
Converging
like
modalities.
Yeah, they converge at some point. Like, okay, that's not going to be very useful for a lot of the sort of discourse and reasoning we normally engage in. But I want to say that that's as far as it goes, right? It's not like the original version is like the true modality and this one's false or maybe just useless, or I don't know if you're, but you seem to be more on the page of, I mean, there is a right metaphysical modality and this is my theory of it, so to speak.
Well, yeah, but like I just said, I mean, I'm not massively wedded to that. It's fruitful and fun. I mean, and that's enough. It doesn't have to be. I'm not some like solemn truth seeker, I'm fine with it. I mean, if you're really interested in what's true, then you should be doing science, not philosophy, because science is a much more reliable way of getting at least close to the truth. But philosophy, certainly metaphysics, you have no idea whether you're ever making any progress or if it's all completely bullshit. Like, that's part of the discipline. So I think it's foolish to be a solemn truth seeker and do metaphysics, right? It's not that type of game. What I'm saying is, there's something interesting about trying to make sense of the world, and there's a kind of combination of things that you could try and draw a picture that encompasses. So, like, there's partly this kind of manifest image of like, what does it seem like when I'm alive in the world? And my experience of things is certainly like making decisions, planning things for the future. Past is fixed. There seems to be a kind of modal asymmetry at play at the basis of that. It makes sense of a lot of things to suppose that there's some kind of modal asymmetry, that's indicative of the way the world is. It's a fruitful hypothesis to explore. Is it true? I mean, I don't know if it's true. It doesn't really matter if it's true or not, but it's fruitful to explore the idea anyway, regardless of whether it is. I mean, obviously there's some similarities with this idea to this kind of Everettian quantum mechanics interpretation. So there's some sort of thought that it might have connection to realistic theories of physics or something, but I don't really care. I mean, there's just a scientific image and a manifest image, and it's nice to have both of these cohere as much as possible, but like, yeah, there's loads of ways you could do that. And if you had to try and like determine the truth doing this, you'd go mad. I mean, there's no way you could really survey everything and like balance absolutely everything out. You just have to sort of do some stuff, do some work, think of things. It's like if you had to know that your chess opening is going to get you a win, you'd never play a move. You have to take a leap and see what happens, it seems to me. So yeah, I'm not a solemn truth seeker. I'm not wedded to this idea of it being necessarily true. I just like the theory and see what happens if we talk about it. And another thing, if you take that view, then it gets you out of some other hot potato situations, right? And then it sort of changes the discussion, because now it's a question of like, well, what's your theory of modality? I mean, because you can phrase an argument that sort of uses the words metaphysical modality all the time. And then when you start to think about, well, actually, there's loads of different theories here. Which one do you mean? Is it true on all of them? Or does the argument break down on some of them? And it seems to me it's worth pointing out that here's a view on which the argument breaks down. And you can't blame anything apart from the theory of modality. But then how are you motivating that theory is wrong, right? I mean, it looks nice, but what are you going to do? Defend some Lewisian theory of metaphysical modality? I mean, go ahead, right? There's another burden of like justification you've got to make in order to make the Grim Reaper argument. So it's fruitful to just sort of explain how it's not just like this slam dunk thing that's like the premises are all obviously true, the inference is obviously valid, and therefore it's game over, right? There's loads of things that it involves, and it's sort of interesting to see the intersection of this idea with another idea. That's all.
Yeah, that's very good. I can definitely sympathize with that general outlook. It's almost a little bit, pragmatist in a way, but not really.
Yeah. I guess so.
Because at some point we're like, we got to do something, we got to figure out what works, and we're going to look for the truth, but there's going at it in that solemn truth seeker way is maybe going to be less effective and less interesting.
Yeah,
as well.
Mm-hmm.
What was I going to say? Yeah, so I did want to bring up the and I might tie this back into the modality more generally, but on the patchwork principle stuff, so I don't think we introduced it. So roughly speaking, with the patchwork principles, it's the point, well, so the basic idea is that if you have, as I recall, if you have sort of regions of space-time which are themselves possible, and at some possible world, and you can combine them to form a new possible world, patching them all together, so long as the world you're patching them into is like big enough for whatever, it satisfies certain criteria, that it could hold all these patches, that what you patch together will be necessarily possible. You necessarily patch together a possible world, something like that. And where people have sometimes used this against, you could try to use something like this against the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis, which is going to say, well, maybe it's not going to work against you because you might not grant that the worlds we're patching from are themselves possible or something. I don't know. But if someone were to say that, there could be some possible world at which is a Reaper at precisely this time performing his task and precisely this time, presumably we could take all those infinitely many different Reapers, patch them into one world, and so they perform the Reaper task.
Yeah.
And then it's not going to be enough, assuming that this principle is true, to suppose to respond just to say it's an unsatisfiable pair, because really the pair should be satisfiable if the universe could be past eternal and so forth. And so the universe can't be past eternal. Well, I mean, first, broadly speaking, what do you make of like that sort of patchwork principle?
Well, I mean, patchwork principles has kind of got this intuitive base to it, right? But put it as simply as possible, the idea is like anything can coexist with anything else, right? And that's the basic thought, and that does, strikes you as quite plausible when you first hear it, kind of thing. Especially, imagine, there's an ice cream truck and like a library. If each of those is possible, it would be weird to think that there couldn't be like an ice cream truck next to a library. Why, right? If each of them is possible. So the principle seems easy until you start really trying to spell it out in detail. Because obviously, to begin with, you have to say, well, as long as they don't like actually overlap with each other. Because like, is it possible that an ice cream truck and a library occupy exactly the same space? I mean, maybe not. That sounds a bit weird, right? So what we mean is like if they're non-overlapping, then yeah, why not? So spatio-temporal regions where they don't overlap, you can sort of patch them together, and you get a third world. But then, like, there has been immediately after introducing this so this comes from David Lewis, and for the first time he talks about it, it's in weirdly in reference to a paper by Derek Parfit on like the fusion and division of like the self over time or whatever, like with Siamese twins and whatever. Anyway, but it's just a slightly different concept, philosophy of mind and identity over time or whatever. And he reintroduces it in his Plurality of Worlds a few years later and gives it a bit more time to explain it. And immediately after saying, look, the idea is basically, it's on the chapter that's called The Plentitude of Worlds, right? Where he's saying there's no gaps in modal space, right? And one way he tries to explain this is saying, look, anything can coexist with anything else. There can't just be a gap where two things are possible, but their combination together is impossible. But then he immediately starts going, well, size and shape permitting. And he gives that kind of example of like, you can't have like infinitely many things all in exactly the same region. So I guess you couldn't have that. But the idea is that like the simple way of putting it admits of counterexamples, but trying to express the patchwork principle in such a way that makes sense is actually rather difficult to do, to give a plausible version of it. So it's kind of like you start pulling a thread, or it's sort of a promissory note or something to an actual principle that's sort of robust. So it's a kind of general principle, it's a kind of thumbnail sketch of something. So at best, it's a kind of like an unreliable guide around modal space. It seems to me like it's okay, as what we've got to do as reasoners and kind of causal agents or whatever is make the best guess in a lot of situations. And a lot of the time you can say, well, I've seen, I don't know, X and I've seen Y, so like I might expect at some future time that an X and a Y will come along together or something. And what you're doing in that type of reasoning is basically patching together things that were individually possible because you saw them, thinking they might happen together. But it's obviously not completely reliable because there are things where you can't combine them together, and size and space permitting, exactly, those types of things. So it's not the absolutely characterizing condition of what's possible. And but on the other hand, you kind of need it to make it needs to be reliable enough to guide you through the premises of the Grim Reaper argument. Because, I mean, can you cut and paste infinitely many Grim Reapers and put them into one world together? I mean, if you can, then you're in trouble. But like, what does can mean in this context? Are we talking metaphysical possibility? Because like, I've already explained in principled reason why you might deny that in this context. But I mean, the way Kuhn's describes it, it's awfully complicated way of putting it, really. But he has, pick a world where something as a Grim Reaper and another world where there's another Grim Reaper. And now you also have to have a third world, which is kind of a container world, which has enough room for them both to coexist. And now that means you've got a fourth world in which is the same size as a container world, which actually does have the thing from the first world and the thing from the second world in it. So the most simple expression of the Patchwork principle for Kuhn's involves 4 worlds, which seems a bit over the top, but he needs to have this container world idea in there because then he wants to extend it out to being like you could cut and paste infinitely many of these together. But it strikes me as rather odd because, I mean, unless you've got a container world that's big enough to put infinitely many Reapers in, which kind of sounds like it has to be an infinitely big world, right? Then you can't, I mean, unless that world is there somehow, what does there mean? Possible? Unless there's a container big enough. Because if there's no container big enough, then finitism is true. You can't fit all the Grim Reapers in together because every world is finite towards the past and the future. But if there is a world big enough to fit them in, then there's a possible world which is not finite, and therefore finitism is false. And so, and either way, the Grim Reapers don't really seem to do anything. So, like, I've never really understood how Kuhn's Patchwork principle doesn't just beg the question here. I mean, like, either an infinitely big world is possible, in which case, there it is anyway, regardless of what you're going to go on to say about Grim Reapers, or it's not possible, in which case it's not there anyway, regardless of what you say about the Reapers. But in either case, it doesn't really matter what you say about the Reapers. So I don't know if his version of the principle really makes sense on its own, but regardless, fuck that principle. I don't care about that principle. I don't see why I have to buy that. And he doesn't buy it either. He rejects it anyway. So it is proofs. So, like, find me someone who actually accepts that principle, and it's their problem, right? But it's not nobody else's problem. So I think it looks weird anyway. So summarizing, right? It's a kind of intuitive idea in its core, but like, who cashes it out properly? No one really agrees on that. What about Kuhn's version? That looks terribly suspect. Who buys it? Basically nobody. So Kuhn's version of the argument is particularly troublesome. I think the thing about his version of the argument is it's really technical looking. There's loads of like precision. I mean, his is about placing a particle on a plane and blah blah blah. The premises are all spelled out rather, precisely or whatever. It's not hand wavy argument, but that Patchwork principle just doesn't look remotely plausible to me. Well, it suffers from this sort of question begging problem. So I never really understand. I mean, like, can I patch infinitely many empty regions of space-time together? Like fly off into intergalactic void, get some millimeter-sized tiny piece of space, and just patch it together infinitely many times. And now I seem to have a universe with nothing in it. Is that a licensed application of the Patchwork principle? Because if it is, then an empty infinite universe is possible. I mean, and I just don't understand why you would reject that being possible just because if you filled it with Reapers, it would be contradictory. I think I just don't get it. Why wouldn't you just say, well, you just can't fill it with Reapers then? But like, if we bought that principle, it seems that we've got like a well-reasoned example of how that principle shows you that an infinite universe is possible, like with nothing in it, then it's possible. Now, I don't know if that violates some laws of physics or something that you have to have matter to have a space-time manifold or whatever. I don't know enough physics to know anything about that, but I mean, it just seems like if you just run that principle, then you can reason your way into at least as strong an argument to suppose the universe could be infinite and empty, as you can to show that it couldn't be infinite and filled with Reapers. So
yeah. It also seems like on that you could reason to there being no necessary beings, which a lot of often theists that are arguing for this are not going to want to accept.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so there's this bit in Proust's book where he ends up saying, that this kind of recombination or patchwork principle is key to loads of the arguments in his book. But then he says they can't all be true, or there must be some restrictions on these principles, right? Because otherwise you'd have this grim Punisher scenario. Do you know this one?
No.
The grim Punisher. So it's he says, look, imagine God exists, right? But that there's some world where an agent can dish out arbitrarily large electric shocks to somebody, for insignificant slights to his character. So, I snub you by not complimenting you on your new hat or something, and you give me like a trillion volt electric shock by touching some dial. And he says, look, that, well, it's possible because you could think of a world where I'm giving you like a mild electric shock or something, a static shock or something for that social slight to your new hat, where justice would be, preserved with you doing it. The kind of like horribly electrocuting you to death for that is just unjust to the point where a good God wouldn't allow that to happen. So if God exists, then some otherwise sort of mathematically possible rearrangements of actual things would be not possible because God wouldn't allow them to happen. I mean, it's a really strange argument for one thing, because like, well, if you're allowed to do that, then you don't buy the patchwork principle. So there goes one of the premises of the Grim Reaper argument. But like, the unsatisfiable pair guy isn't saying, imagine God exists and stops people doing electric shocks. He's just saying, imagine that there are no contradictions. I mean, like, surely that's a shared supposition for everybody, whether they're theists or not. So invoking this weird theistic kind of restriction on which world combinations are possible seems way more arbitrary than just saying, let's just suppose no like inconsistent combinations of things are possible. It seems like perfectly, as if that's not allowed in Western philosophy, then nothing is, right? But it also just seems like a weird thing to say, because like, if God would rule out these like arbitrarily large electric shocks, why did he let the Holocaust happen? I don't even understand. Is this world even possible under Bruce's idea of what God would allow? I mean, it just seems like he does allow almost arbitrarily large amounts of suffering happen like all the time. So I really don't get them. It seems like we live in the Grim Punisher world in some ways. So I'm not really sure how that is supposed to help, but yeah, I mean, yeah, okay. Anyway, sorry, I got off on a tangent about that.
That's good. I'd heard something like that. I guess the same sort of thing, because you could imagine a world, patching together a world with God, but also it's like pretty much all the things you're patching in are just evils, like immense suffering and so forth. Presumably that's going to be inconsistent with God's benevolence and other properties. And so really haven't patched together a possible world. Are they going to say that God's not possible then, or God doesn't exist? Like,
yeah, right.
Yeah, I doubt it. But yeah, I think we're on the same page that what they should say is that that's not a possible world. And just because you've done this procedure and this patchwork principle, okay, it might be a decent, in many cases, heuristic for making inferences about modal space, and to which degree that is, it's up for debate, I suppose. But there might be cases in which it fails, and here it fails because you patched together an inconsistent world that your principle says should be possible.
It's a patchwork principle. It's like a principle about the epistemology of modal metaphysics. It's a really obscure thing, right? Like, how do we know what's metaphysically possible and what's not? And I mean, you're quite within your rights to just say, we just don't know very much, right? Like, I know basic things, like, I mean, we suppose that anything that's logically impossible is metaphysically impossible, and anything that's actual is metaphysically possible. But like, stray very far away from these couple of like pillars of things that seem reasonable. Give me a big formula in modal logic. Really hard to use my intuition or whatever to tell me if that's possible or not. So maybe I can come up with a kind of a useful guide or something. What we're talking about is like coming to decide whether or not that's something I know in modal metaphysics. And I mean, yeah, it's just a very strange. You don't need it to do modal logic. You don't need the patchwork principle to do modal logic. You don't really need it for very much. I mean, as I said, you can use it to license and run-of-the-mill inferences you make every day, but they're going to be very much defeasible instances of that, where if it lets you down, you don't think, oh, well, that must be false then. You just think it's defeasible. Sometimes it doesn't work, right? That's fine. But then, that just gives you a get out of jail card if somebody tries to sort of make an ironclad argument that relies on it being true in a given instance.
Yeah, and the response that someone might have, and I think Joshua Rasmussen was saying something like this, is that you could think of it as a sort of just a epistemological principle, but on the other hand, perhaps it's like an actual principle of logic, a law of logic or of metaphysics or something. The Patchwork principle is, and in that case, it's not going to do any good to say that it's a principle that's led you astray, because that's what is kind of fixing what the space of possibilities is. But I don't see any reason to include it among those principles of logic or metaphysics. But I mean, what do you take on that?
What you're going to find is that like something has to go at some point, right? I mean, there are clear things you can see clearly, like so for instance, the derivation of the contradiction from the assumption that both of the A and B conditions are satisfied, that derivation can be seen very, very clearly. And like we also, lots of us have quite a strong commitment to the law of non-contradiction, say. But then now you find that if the modal patchwork principle, taking it as a theory of modality, as a sort of logical or metaphysical principle rather than an epistemological one, like a defeasible rule or something, you're taking it as an exceptionless metaphysical principle. Well, now you've just got yourself into an incompatible triad, because how do you maintain the law of non-contradiction is true, the A and B conditions both satisfied, and the patchwork principle is true? I mean, something's got to go here, right? And what on earth motivates the idea that the patchwork principle, with all its flaws and problems, which we talked about a moment ago, should be held in the face of the others, right? It's very easy to relegate that to just being an unreliable epistemological guide. And we just don't see any reason to now think, well, I must hold on to that as a metaphysical principle, therefore, and so I've got to make one metaphysical concession over here, and I've got to make another one now. I've got to reject the A condition. There can't be any infinite sequences of any type. Why make such an egregious? That just seems, again, like flagrantly breaking Occam's razor here. We're just doing metaphysics, making metaphysical assumptions where they're patently not justified. They're not doing any work. That we're just compounding assumption upon assumption here. That's just not the right way to do analysis or theory building, seems to me. So, I mean, again, you can take a completely different view on that, but that just seems the right way to do it for me. Like this kind of Quinean thing about the preference for the desert landscapes. I mean, you don't have to want completely sparse theories, but you should want, it seems to me, to have a kind of nice balance between the commitments that you give in your theories and the work that they do for you. And I want my commitments to do stuff, and I don't want to make commitments about things if they're not obviously earning their keep. So I'm sort of motivated by that idea that I'm not going to pay ontological cost here if I could get away with just denying that, just relegating that Patchwork principle to just being something about the epistemology of modality that I've got wrong. I mean, that just seems like a very easy, cost-effective way to negotiate my way through this situation, whereas paying a load of ontology to get out of that difficult spot just seems like not the right way to go. I mean, I'm a cheapskate when it comes to paying ontology for stuff, I guess. Maybe Rasmussen's got more money going around than I have, and he wants to spend it on getting out of ontological problems. But for me, I'm going to keep I'm really stretching this analogy further than we should. But you get my point, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I was thinking about different potential counterexamples to the Patchwork principle, and there's a few different sorts. One is that we might talk about these various infinite cases and say that they really are consistent, and so it should be possible. And Patchwork principle, which says that they aren't, is therefore false. But then there's the finite cases, which are maybe more interesting to people that will try to run this type of argument, because they think the finite cases should be consistent. one sort of those cases is where the scenario conflicts with some other um, maybe metaphysical truth apart from that. So the case with a great many, perhaps although finite number of evils might conflict with the metaphysical necessity of God or something. But maybe there's a case where it's internally inconsistent, even though finite. And I was thinking of the following sort of case, a kind of amendment of the light bulb case that I had in the. I mean, it's the same structure. That was a structure, the same structure as the paradox. So it's not really anything new. But so here's the setup. If you, for any of these given light bulbs, if it forms a line, which need to be a straight line, and I could talk more about, how what cases it forms a line, but whatever. If it forms a line, it's on if and only if none of the light bulbs to its left in that line are on.
Mm-hmm.
And if you had 10 light bulbs in a line, okay, that's good. The leftmost light bulb will be on and the rest will be off. But I was thinking, what if the line connects back onto itself? So effectively, you have a circle here.
Mm-hmm.
There's finally many light bulbs, but now if you take one of them, if you go around to its left, well, it's going to come back to itself. It's only going to be on if it's off, and if it's off, it's going to be on.
That's right.
You might say, "Oh, this is a problem of self-reference or something else," but I mean, yes, of course, the situation is going to be paradoxical, but on its own, positing any one of these light bulbs isn't going to generate the absurdity. But there's only finitely many, so doesn't that satisfy a kind of a finite counterexample to the Patchwork principle? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I like that. I think it's very clever and very simple as well. And surprising, actually, I haven't seen that in the literature. So this is an obvious thought to just construct a circular model, because you get into the same problems. And what are you going to do? Ban circular lines of light bulbs or something? Like, it seems a weird metaphysical gap for that. But that does seem like it's the solution here, the causal finitist. Like if you have the infinitely long line of straight line of light bulbs, they're going to say, well, that shows you that space can't be infinitely long. And so the causal finitist doesn't just say time is discrete and finite. They also have to bite the bullet and say the same thing about space. And I think they also have to say that circles are impossible, given what you just said. So, otherwise, why pick one approach in one case and not in another? It seems like cherry picking to just say, well, it proves time is finite because that fits with my theology, but because my theology doesn't ban circles, I'm not going to make exactly the same move there. So, yeah, I think that's really nice. And I really can't see how they would have a principled way of not looking stupid there.
Yeah, because what's the alternative, right? If they're going to say, well, I'm just going to amend the Patchwork principle so that it doesn't permit cases like that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then I could generate more, first of all. But even aside from that, it just seems ad hoc. It doesn't seem really plausible at all.
Yeah, and Kuhn's actually complains about, he imagines somebody modifying the Patchwork principle in an ad hoc way and says you can't do that. That would be intolerably ad hoc or whatever. And yeah, so what's he going to say here about this circles case? It'd be interesting to actually, maybe you should write to him and ask him what he thinks. Or maybe write to Proust and ask him about that, because he's quite good at replying to emails if he likes them.
Yeah, that's a good point. I should probably do that. Because I just thought of that in because I was thinking, is there another like finite counterexample to the Patchwork principle? And it seems that sort of thing is going to work. Maybe there's a great family of them that would work, but
I'm sure there will be once you start thinking about it. And it seems to me it makes the case even easier for the unsatisfiable pair person, because they're just going to say, look, obviously circles of lights are possible. Obviously, in some cases you can have the lights having that rule where they're on if and only if none of the ones to the left are on. But what you can't do is have both of them at the same time. That's it. That's the only thing you can't have. And it seems a bit weird to think, I mean, that some metaphysical concession would be made to get around that, rather than just acknowledging that you can't have those two things together because they're logically impossible.
Yeah, no, I did want to say, like, and this was something I mentioned in that video, like, at the end of the day, like, if the absurdity is supposed to be the in eternity of the past, or the density of time, or the size of an object, then he should be able to draw, demonstrate the absurdity merely from that. Like, why does the absurdity seem to only follow when you have these absurdly constructed objects? Like, an infinite sequence of line of light bulbs, if they're all off, what's the problem with that? Like, there's nothing absurd about that. You only get this absurdity when the construction of the object follows some unsatisfiable pattern.
Yeah, that's right.
And if they want to say something like, if there can be an object of that size, then it should be able to follow that unsatisfiable pattern. I deny that. That just seems ridiculous.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so too for all the other cases involving Grim Reapers or whatever. So I just don't. Doesn't seem to have any force to me.
Yeah, it's like guilt by association or something, where you've got like the kind of naughty object, which is impossible because it's contradictory, and then you've got the innocent one that stood next to it, which is the same size, but it's doesn't have the contradiction. And it's like the theologian here is saying, look at the naughty one, and that guy stood right next to him, so he must also be naughty as well. And it's just like, no. I mean, anyone who's looked after kids before will realize, they're not all equally misbehaved. Some of them are worse than others, right? Some of them are well behaved, and you can't just lump them all together because they're standing in the same room as each other. So it seems to me that's just a plain case of guilt by association, and we should just resist that. That like empty, infinite universe. I'm yet to see anyone really explain what's wrong with that. So what the general strategy is to say, look, if an infinite universe were possible, then something else would be possible. And it's that inference that's dodgy. It's the same thing that's in play in, Andrew Loke has this like hotel room builder example. Same thing there, right? He's saying, look, if the past was infinite, then it could have been that God was making a room, one per day, throughout that entire infinite past. But if that was the case, then it'd be a Hilbert's Hotel today. And he's convinced that it couldn't be a Hilbert's Hotel today. And that shows you that the past couldn't be infinite. But I mean, it seems to me that let's just grant that Hilbert's Hotel is impossible, an assumption I don't share, but let's play the game and grant that that's impossible. Well, now it follows that if the past was infinite and Hilbert's Hotel is impossible, then it couldn't be filled. The past couldn't be filled with God making a hotel room one per day, because otherwise it would be Hilbert's Hotel, right? So you just sort of modus tollens it. I mean, like, if I forget that one of the assumptions of the argument is that Hilbert's Hotel is impossible, then I can sort of see my way to starting off with there being an infinite past, and then thinking it must be possible then that God could fill all of that with doing nothing but making hotel rooms. But if you remind yourself that we're supposed to remember that it couldn't be a Hilbert's Hotel, then we've just got an inconsistent set of propositions. So it doesn't matter, right? Like, that's why it's not possible. You've contradicted yourself. You just didn't realize you were doing it, or something, forgot one of your assumptions and didn't realize you contradicted yourself. So it seems to me that Locke's argument has this very similar pattern of like, assume some innocent thing was true, now assume that it would imply some guilty thing was true as well, and then reason backwards that the innocent thing must be guilty. But just I don't associate the guilt with one with the innocence of the other, effectively. Which I think it's just a sort of less clear way of saying what you were saying. Really. So I mean, I think we're on the same page with this.
Yeah, and I mean, the Hilbert's Hotel case is in some ways similar. I think we're probably on the same, not in the same, well, in the Look case where someone's like always been constructing, or God's always been constructing, if we're given the branching view of modality, you're going to just say, well, unless someone's actually been doing that, then there isn't a possibility of that.
That's right. Yeah.
And now you might just say, well, even given that, there's a possibility that one day it just kind of appears that there's a Hilbert's Hotel. I mean, I'm sort of the view that I don't really see the absurdity in just having a Hilbert's Hotel and performing certain operations on it. Maybe everyone in the even room moving to everyone moving to a room twice as number or whatever. And then more people checking in. I don't see it's unintuitive, I guess.
It's weird.
But yeah. And you're right. If it violates some metaphysical truth, suppose that such a hotel could exist, or that certain operations on it could be performed, then okay, then you couldn't have a Hilbert's Hotel. I don't see why the existence of the hotel or certain operations performed on it would follow from an eternal past or an infinitely large universe or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, you could get into trouble if you were for some reason antecedently committed to the idea that what's sometimes called like a Euclid's maxim, right? That the whole is greater than the part. If you thought that was an inviolable metaphysical principle, and then you think, well, maybe Hilbert's Hotel could exist. Well, now plausibly you've got some kind of contradiction, because, I mean, now you've got a whole where proper parts are equal, at least in cardinality to it. Some subsection of the hotel rooms, it's just as many as the whole of the hotel rooms. So, well, what are you going to do there? I mean, it seems to me, it's true you can't have both of those, the Euclidean maxim and a Hilbert's Hotel. But I mean, if a Hilbert's Hotel existed, that just means that Euclid's maxim wouldn't be, universally true. It's true for finite sets. It's not true for infinite sets. So you'd say something like, for the finite regions of the universe, or for every sub-region of the universe or something, every finite part of it, Euclid's maxim is true. It's just not true for the whole of it. I mean, and there you go. I mean, another, the most plausible attempt of making contradiction out of Hilbert's Hotel just sort of evaporates in a puff of smoke, because, you don't have to say the Euclidean maxim is true absolutely everywhere all the time. I mean, when was that universally agreed upon? It's not my idea anyway. So yeah, most of the time with these, it's just a question of philosophers just sort of learn how to talk, shape their intuitions in line with the developments of reason or whatever. When Cantor worked out a way of thinking about the infinite, we all worked out how to think about it in the same way, and our pre-theoretical intuitions didn't point in that direction, but iron filings with a magnet going over it, we're now pointing in the right direction. And it seems weird to dig your heels in and say, no, my intuitions must be respected, so I'm going to deny some aspect of this theory or whatever. I just really don't understand it. It's like a parochialism at its worst.
Yeah. And when I think about some of the set theoretic stuff, if you're first learning about infinite sets, for example, and the various properties, it may seem wrong to you, right? Because you're used to thinking about finite arrangements of sets of things and so on, and the various properties that those satisfy. Not just because we're used to, that's what we're introduced first mathematically, but that's what we interact with finite many things in the world, generally speaking.
Of course, yeah.
And that heuristic that the proper subset of a set is going to be strictly smaller in size than the set breaks down when applied to the infinite case. That's not to say that I mean, one way someone might go is to say, well, I'm just so committed to this, principle of regarding cardinality of different of a proper subset, that I'm going to just say that, no, infinite sets are impossible, even as a mathematical construction. But that just seems the wrong way to go to me. I don't see why we would be so wedded to that sort of property of sets.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know. Maybe it's not like I know. Again, we're coming back to this, like, what's a fruitful way to go, and like that kind of Cantorian, if you like, research program of like doing transfinite mathematics or whatever way Cantor showed us how to do that whole thing is fruitful intellectually, and that's not to say that it's true, but it's just like, what's going on when somebody digs their heels in and refuses to accept a paradigm change like that. It might be that they're right and the community of experts is wrong and stuff happens, but it might also just be that they are, for one other reason or another, refusing to get with the program. I mean, you never really know, of course, because we could be in a paradigm that's completely wrong. But the idea is really just like, what's motivating the resistance to adapting your intuitions to fit with what it looks like to the rest of the community to be the behavior. I mean, so what's maddening about, like, if you're just a finitist and you just deny even the Cantorian stuff, you just say, oh, that's just wrong or whatever, and fair enough. I mean, that's in a way it's kind of a pure perspective to take. So if you're kind of intuitionist or something about mathematics, and you have your own way of doing stuff, it's true is what's provable, blah, 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 then you don't have any infinite sets. And, you just bite the bullet and you say, currently unproven mathematical conjectures are neither true nor false, right? Like, okay, fair enough. Like, then there's purity to that position. The maddening thing is that Craig's view is that, like, yeah, there's nothing wrong with Cantorian mathematics, right? It's perfectly consistent. It's a go for it, mathematicians. You're all good to do that. It's not a finitist in that intuitionist sense. He's just saying the world doesn't obey that, like, type of sort of logic or whatever that you get in Cantorian systems. And, like, how do you know? I mean, it's just a weird thing to say. I mean, well, what's motivating that, right? I'd rather be open-minded. I haven't searched around everywhere. I don't know. Maybe there's a Hilbert's Hotel somewhere on the other side of the universe somewhere, right? I mean, maybe it's there. So what do you do then if you get there and you find it? I mean, do you still dig your heels in and say, I must be hallucinating? This couldn't be happening because of my prior intuition about Euclid's maxim. I mean, it just feels bizarre, right? Like, maybe you like Euclid's maxim, but it feels like it's playing a disproportionate role in your theory, in theorizing, if you just refuse to give up under any circumstances. I mean, so in a way, I kind of feel sympathetic about this same proposal here, even when it comes to the law of non-contradiction. I mean, I don't really know that that's true. Maybe it's not true. It seems to me if it's not true, it's not gonna lead to, like, trivialism or something. It just seems to me there are still non-trivial black and white truths about the world. But, like, yeah, maybe it's not an exceptionless principle. I don't know. Whatever. So like, if I take even that approach with the law of non-contradiction, I mean, sure, I'm going to take the same approach with Euclid's maxim, or like whether there could be a concrete object that's infinitely big. I mean, basically, I just don't know, right? But show me the contradiction or go away. I suppose you can't really take that view with the law of non-contradiction. What you have to do there is explain some reason why accepting it has intolerable consequences other than inconsistency. Obviously, you have to show something else is intolerable about that assumption. And I mean, maybe you can do that in a lot of cases, but I'm just not convinced necessarily you have to do that when it comes to intractable looking things like the liar paradox. I don't know. We've got a lot of respect for Graham Priest, basically. Really like his work on that. But I'm not an expert, so I mean, I could be completely wrong about it.
Yeah, I think I'm probably on the same page there. Like, if we had really, really good reason to think that some proposition was true and to think that its negation was true, I could imagine myself giving up commitment to law of non-contradiction.
Yeah.
Why? If I could say, if I'm going to say that no, I could never reject non-contradiction, why? Presumably, we could have other things which seem even harder for us to deny. In principle, I could find myself in that epistemic state. Then I would find myself wanting to give up the law of non-contradiction.
Yeah.
It seems like the right, fair approach.
As long as you do it in such a way that you also give up double negation, elimination, and proof by reduction, and stuff like that. I mean, like, as long as you're doing that, that's true, and a principle of explosion or whatever, so that you don't end up trivializing everything else you believe, then, you know, perfectly reasonable position to take, it seems to me. It's a kind of dialethiist who employs a paraconsistent logic, right? Because they're basically going to say the same thing as a classical guy about basically everything, apart from one or two things where they differ. So it's like, you know, you may have previously thought, sort of pre-theoretically or whatever, that every arithmetical truth must be provably true or provably false. I mean, like, how could one escape the kind of grinding mechanism of arithmetical proofs that you can produce? But actually there are some, right? Because Gödel showed that. So game over to the idea that every arithmetic truth is provably true or provably false. Like, it's not the case. What does that mean? Does it mean we can't count trees anymore and, you know, do basic arithmetic? No, it doesn't have any consequence, right? Like, the world before Gödel's proof and the world after Gödel's proof is exactly the same. I mean, no dramatic consequences, really. The only differences are for people who are like deep into some research program in set theory or whatever. It completely rocks their world, but everybody else's world is exactly the same. And if the law of non-contradiction was false, it might be like that, you know, some set theorists get upset, but like no one else even notices. So I mean, like, you know, it could be inconsequential if that's the case. It's the same sort of thing here. I mean, maybe some infinite concrete object exists, you know, locked inside a black hole, or, you know, on the other side of the universe, beyond the boundary of what's observable or something. It just won't make any difference to you. It doesn't matter. And no consequence to it, no absurdities, no grim reapers killing you, whatever. Nothing happens. It's just there, you know, like, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, that's good. And like, I'm even, people often talk about whether there could be truth value gaps as well. And arguably there's like decent motivation for that. Vagueness, among other things, seems to lend itself at least to that sort of view.
Yeah, I mean, and Aristotle posed that as a solution on interpretation himself, right? So
for future tense propositions and stuff like
exactly,
that.
for future contingents. Yeah. So it's not like everyone says, well, the three laws of logic. People who don't know anything about what they're talking about, there's three laws of logic: non-contradiction, identity, and excluded middle. Yeah. And then you can't possibly deny any of those. And it's just like, yes, but like, literally from the day it was invented, people have been denying these things, finding counterexamples for them. So yeah, it shows a lot of people have no idea what they're talking about when it comes to these things.
Yeah. So I did want to talk about another one of the arguments that I discussed in that video, which was on the if someone had always been counting down, say, the natural numbers, or counting up the negative integers, I guess. I think Craig has made this sort of argument, but others have used something like it, which is that if there's someone who's been always counting in this way, well, given that they've always been counting, there was, like, on any given day, there was enough time for them to have finished the count, so they should have finished it that day. But that's true for any day, and so it doesn't seem like there's any day on which they could have finished it. I mean, I guess I can get to some of my thoughts. I mean, what do you think about that sort of argument?
Well, this argument is my diagnosis of this is basically the same as one that's been given in print a couple of times before. Richard Sorabji and Wes Morriston already made this point, but it's just, it's not that. So Craig says should. He uses the word should. So like if there's already been an infinite amount of time, then he should have finished his count by now. I mean, should is a weird word to use. I mean, should normally carries a kind of normative aspect to it. Like you should, study hard or something. Like, I mean, what do you mean? He would have finished his count by now. If that's what he's saying, it just seems false to me. Like, I mean, because confusing and necessary for a sufficient condition, and I think he even uses the word sufficient. Like, there's been sufficient time for him to do it, so it's as if that means that you've worked out what a sufficient condition is, right? But that's just confusing two uses of the word sufficient, right? Like there being enough time to count down from through all of the natural numbers doesn't entail that you are counting down through them. It's not a sufficient condition for you finishing your count now. So think about it. Think about it like this. If you're finishing an infinite countdown now, then there's been infinitely many past times, right? You finishing now is a sufficient condition for there being an infinitely many past times, right? That's the right way around. But if you say, if there's been infinitely many past times now, then you're finishing an infinite countdown now, that's obviously wrong. You've flipped the conditional round the wrong way, but yet that's the way Craig does it, right? As if just there being enough time for you to finish entails that you will have done, or even implies that you will have done. It doesn't imply that at all. Well, if it implies anything, what it implies is that you could have finished a countdown by now. So not should or would, but could, right? If there's been enough time now, I could have finished counting down by now. That's true. Yeah, I agree. In a universe that has no beginning to it, in a certain sense, somebody could be finishing a countdown every day. Like a different person could be finishing a countdown every single day throughout the whole of time. But that's true, but it doesn't follow that there's no reason why somebody is finishing their countdown on a specific day just because they've had enough time to do it. And it is a blatant confusion of necessary and sufficient conditions in this argument. And that's the point that's been raised numerous times in the literature. And it's actually amazing that Craig doesn't understand that point. I mean, this is one of those ones where I really don't get it because it's so crystal clear. It's such an elementary point. There's nothing else to say about that, right? It's rare that this sort of thing happens, but that really is a game over comeback to that argument. He's just completely got that wrong. He must know of that objection, but he still goes on about it as if it's never been, nothing's been said to undermine that. I mean, it's in his 2018 paper at the end of the book on the philosophical arguments for the Kalam. He has this huge article at the end where he summarizes everything, and he even uses the word should in that. It's like he just copy and pastes from previous times where he's put it and never updated that. So I don't get it. I'm not one of these people who says Craig's a liar and a fraud and whatnot, but like I'm just baffled to understand how he doesn't get this bit of the argument. And I tried to ask him about it I think I even made the point to him when I talked to him, but it certainly didn't land. And he sort of giggled and didn't really get it. And yeah, but that's as clean a kill as you ever see in these sorts of things. Which I think is basically the same as your response, if I remember it rightly. It's a sort of similar idea.
Yeah, I say a similar sort of. I mean, imagine if you said the same sort of thing in a finite case, right? At least 100 days have elapsed. So I could. We don't want to say that the conditions are sufficient, given that I've been counting down from 100 for me to finish the count today, because I might not have been counting, or I might not have started the count 100 days ago. Right? It depends on where I am in my count relative, like to the present, so to speak. That determines when the conditions are sufficient for the completion of the count. I would say the same thing in the infinite case, right? Okay, you can't fix it with respect to some starting date, but pick a point in the count and you can orient that with respect to some other time or the present. And you can say, then that count assuming it continues as it is going to finish on this day. It seems that's going to give you your sufficient conditions. You're going to have some explanation plausibly for why the count finishes on that day, because, well, these numbers were counted on the days before and so forth. It seems good enough to me. I don't see what like remains of that style of argument.
No, I mean, so in a certain sense, there are prior conditions, like what number you were counting yesterday and how quickly you're counting, which entail what number you're counting today. So there certainly are sufficient conditions for your, say, finishing the countdown today. So some prior condition entails that you're finished now, and if anything counts as an explanation, something that entails the thing you're explaining seems like it's good enough, at least in most cases.
Right.
I mean, not in every case, right? There are cases where that wouldn't work, but the kind of Leibnizian idea of what a sufficient reason is something that entails the thing to be explained. So it seems like it satisfies that. I mean, there's this lingering worry that what you've got is a kind of an infinite sequence of events strung together, where each one entails the next one, but nothing really explains why that whole sequence is there rather than some other one. Now, obviously, on my Aristotelian view, it's true in every world, right? That so every world overlaps with the actual world at some point. So there's no world where you can't anchor the number that's being said today in some past condition that entails it. So you've kind of grounded it all down into something that's necessary, and then explanation has come to an end then at that point. So you could just walk away feeling like you've done everything you can. But obviously, I mean, I don't pretend that the Aristotelian theory is like completely perfect, and it doesn't. There's loads of things it doesn't explain. It doesn't like really. It doesn't tell you why objects have the certain capacities that they do rather than other ones, that type of thing. I mean, it just grounds them all down, and you have to give a load of stuff into the actual world before the theory of modality does anything. And this is why it's not sufficient for a theory of modality. It's just a necessary component, a proposal for a necessary component of a theory of modality. So I can understand that people could still, ask for more here, and okay, people might not be happy with the idea that while each part of this infinite sequence gets an explanation, the whole thing doesn't get an explanation. I mean, I do understand that, but it's like, these types of worries are nowhere near the level, it seems to me, of like kind of refutations that people like Craig are trying to give, right? It's like kind of strong, robust Christian apologetics or whatever. This is disagreements two reasonable people can have where there aren't really any good answers one way or the other. I mean, we're satisfying one small set of desiderata here. Like, is there kind of Leibnizian prior entailing condition that you could point to that says why someone would be finishing an infinite countdown today? Yes. Does that mean it's a plausible candidate? Is every single question that we could ask completely satisfied by that? No, I don't think so. But well, does it rebut the argument that we're looking at in a given case? Quite possibly it does. But it doesn't mean you can't think of other ways of forming arguments along the same lines. So, I mean, that one specific argument that Craig gave seems to me is completely dead. And there's, rarely it's one of those arguments that's completely dead. But it doesn't mean that you couldn't think of another way of raising that worry. For instance, whereas Morriston and I disagree about this, I think he thinks there's still a legitimate lingering worry that he shares about there being stuff that's not fully explained. And in fact, he would be a great guest. You should invite him and ask him about this and see what he says. But from what I remember, the last time we talked about this, we came away not seeing things the same way on this subject. So I think very highly of Wes, and he's obviously a perfectly sensible person. And So obviously perfectly sensible people can disagree, or at least I can disagree with a perfectly sensible person anyway about this. And I don't think only idiots disagree with me or something. So yeah. Well, I'll put you in contact with him and say he should come on and talk to you.
Yeah, for sure. That'd be great. I was gonna say on that, like if the question is, supposing that someone actually did, or it's possible that someone has always been counting, whatever. The question is, why is that entire count occurred rather than one which was offset by like a day, right? You know, that they were counting -1 today instead of -2 or whatever. At some point, I think there's just not going to be some further explanation. That's just going to be the world is. I'm no opponent to, brute facts on occasion, right? Explanation is going to run out. I don't think you have everything explained. Necessitarianism is false, right? And if explanation. And now they might say that's a big bullet to bite, and so maybe we give up on the possibility of that count. But I don't think it is.
Yeah, I like that sort of look at this too. So that strong Leibnizian account of what an explanation is, coupled with the thought that every contingent proposition has such an explanation, does lead you into that sort of Van Inwagening style argument. Right. And then you've got two options, which is some contingent thing doesn't get explained, or necessitarianism is true. So that does seem to me pretty difficult to argue with. And all you can do really is say, all right, well, let's talk about a different notion of explanation where it's weaker than entailment, and run the argument again. Well, that's fine, but now we're just changing the subject. I mean, if we stick to the original definitions, something doesn't get explained in that strong sense of explanation. And I think everybody has to accept that. So whether you're a theist or not. So a theist is going to eventually have something like, God just makes a decision to create this world rather than that world. And that doesn't have any further like entailing explanation. Otherwise, necessitarianism would be true. And in this case, I mean, you could say something like, well, okay, there's an infinite string of events, right? Each one entails the next one, but nothing really entails that all of them should happen rather than some other set of things that should happen. But like, in contrast to the God just makes a decision and that's that, at least in this case, every contingent decision itself has, or every contingent proposition itself has an entailing prior condition, right? Which is not the case on the God model, like where the first decision doesn't have anything that entails it. So there's still something that's not explained on the infinite past hypothesis here, which is the totality of the whole things. But in lieu of an explanation for that, what you can offer is a kind of just the conjunction of all of the individual explanations. That's the best you can have. So I can't give you a distinct explanation for all of those things, but I can offer you all of the individual explanations as an offering to appease you, And if you that seems to me it's pretty good as a kind of middle ground here. Like it's, I mean, on the God view, you don't have even that appeasement offering. So you've just got to swallow the fact that there's a completely brute starting point that God just randomly, if you like, just picks one thing rather than another. So, I mean, some people will say it's worse to have infinitely many things where the totality is unexplained, but it seems to me that, well, this is a matter of taste. So there's nothing really decisive here.
Yeah, that seems fair. I mean, it's getting, at some point it's a battle of intuitions, and like, and it'll maybe just bottom out in respectful disagreement, hopefully. But yeah, I know it's getting late there. I don't want to keep you all night.
Yeah, okay. It seems like a decent place to wrap things up, if that's all right with you.
Yeah, I'm good to wrap it up there. Thanks so much for coming on and having a
no problem.
Very interesting discussion. Taking my questions, been really great.
Well, thanks for having me. Been very fun.